Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities app, and Bob Schut is going to be leading, what is this, our fifth installment of Soren Kierkegaard's Works of Love. I am very, very thankful that Bob is leading the discussion today. I don't know if anybody is following along on the podcasting app, SoundCloud, YouTube, or whatever, but I have, for the first time in my life, decided to read the Bible cover to cover. So I know what the heck I'm talking about. And Bob, a very good man, decided to allow me to concentrate on that endeavor and be the teacher for today. So he's going to be driving things. So Bob, take it away. What are you going to be talking to us about?
Okay, we're going to be talking about the law and love, the effects of the law and the love, what the relationship is between the two. Really an interesting subject for me because, as Kierkegaard will tell us, there's an apparent conflict between the law, or no, I should say a perceived conflict between the law and love, as though the two were at opposite ends of a spectrum, if even on the same spectrum. So today we're going to look into that. So what is the law that he's speaking about? I mean, he talks about the law, and when we read about the law in the New Testament, we also hear the same thing. We hear Paul and Jesus and some of the other gospel writers talking about the law. And what does it mean? It could mean the Ten Commandments. It could mean the Torah, what we call the Old Testament. Or it could be the entire temple system is referred to as the law. But here, however, I find that Kierkegaard is probably speaking about the Ten Commandments. And most of the time, that's what Paul is even speaking about. So we'll kind of use that as our default unless he makes any other clarification. The law in our today's context will be the Ten Commandments. So I'm going to open up with a quotation from what is my page 110. It says, "For to talk about love being the fulfilling of the law is once again an impossibility without simultaneously recognizing one's own guilt and making every man guilty." So, what is this connection between guilt and the law and love? This is, again, kind of one of my favorite topics here. Why does love bring about a sense of guilt? Why should it? Well, it's because the law brings about a sense of guilt, because no man is perfect and without sin. But God's love for us reveals God's mercy and His grace. So, if what Kierkegaard is seeing is that the law and love are something that occurs simultaneously, then we have a sense of guilt built into our faith, which comes from the law, and then we also have a sense of God's love, His mercy, and His grace that comes through Jesus Christ. Now, he talks about the law as being indeterminate. And this I remember from the problems that I read in the New Testament about the Pharisees and how they were trying to determine an exactitude, I guess we could say, of the law. What did the law actually mean? I mean, we have 10 commandments, and it seems kind of simple, but not really. And it became a very legalistic nightmare, especially in the days of Christ. What exactly does it mean when one is forbidden to work on the Sabbath? There was a controversy, I'm not sure exactly when it was, not too long ago, which is, I like to call it the Scrabble controversy. It was about Jewish law, and was it a sin to play Scrabble on the Sabbath? And after the theologians got together, made their decision that, hey, there's no problem playing Scrabble on the Sabbath. You just can't keep score.
Well, you know, that's hysterical. You know, I remember this entering into modern politics when Joel Lieberman was Al Gore's vice presidential candidate. Was he the vice presidential candidate back in 2000? I believe he was.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, but I remember in one of the vice presidential, because he is a a committed Jew, that I think someone asked him, well, what if there was some sort of emergency that happened and you had to make a decision on the Sabbath? And I remember Lieberman having to answer that question.
Yeah, they made certain provisions in the law that I believe that they were allowed to fight on the Sabbath under certain conditions. So there were certain conditions that they could do what would be exceptions. But again, what we're doing here is we're showing that the law is indeterminate. It requires a little massaging here and there. It requires, or at least man thinks it requires, his input to make it clear. Kierkegaard is going to give us a little different idea, which is kind of interesting. Now, he uses a phrase called the weakness of the law, and I believe he's probably reflecting on what Paul calls the weakness of the law. It's taken from Romans 8, verses 1 through 4, which read this way. There is therefore now no condemnation to that are in Christ Jesus, for the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the ordinance of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. So the weakness of the law is really not the law itself, but the weakness lies in us and in our inability to live up to the standard. He then relates the law to, or he makes it similar to a shadow. He uses this kind of analogy. He says the law is kind of like a shadow that's indefinite when you compare it to what it's making a shadow of. So when we walk down the street and we see a shadow, we can't really make out whose shadow it is. But if we see the source of the shadow, what's making the shadow, we can very easily recognize the individual. So he speaks about the law as being that kind of a shadow. He says that the Holy Scriptures tell us that the law is a shadow of things to come, which is a quotation from Colossians chapter 2, verse 17, which I don't need to read because that's exactly what it says, that the law is the shadow of the things to come. So the law is some sort of a prophecy, as well as something legal and something that gives us moral compass or moral guidelines. It's also a prophecy of the Messiah to come. When someone makes a sketch, an artist makes a sketch of a work, it's also another example of something indeterminate until it's filled in with its detail. And the law is like a sketch that needs to be fulfilled so that we can see what it actually looks like. The law and love are by the same artist, and they have the same origin. They get along, and they don't quarrel with one another, as the sketch does not disagree with the finished painting. So he's giving us this beautiful picture here of a sketch, and then the finished product, which kind of overlays on the sketch, or at least is, I guess we might say, overlaid or filled in some manner. And it's not like one is a contradiction with the other. It's merely that one isn't necessarily as recognizable as that which is filled in with color and with details and so forth, so that we can recognize exactly what it is. One of the problems that came to mind was that who's going to do this filling in? And what we see here is that in the days of Christ, the Pharisaical group was filling in those ideas, those sketches, with what they considered to be the finished product. And this we have to be very careful about, that we don't begin or try to do God's job by filling in the sketch. We have to let God fill in the sketch and fulfill it, rather than do it ourselves. Now we know that, as we'll see here, who is the fulfillment of the law. Jesus says that love is the sum of the commandments. What does this mean? That love is the fulfillment of the law. So that's the idea is we talk about the law as summed up in the commandments to love God and our neighbor. Jesus takes these elements and he sums them up in such a way that it becomes love. Love for God and love for neighbor. We talked about that last week, the first two commandments, or the greatest two commandments. So he sums up the law. This is a sum of all of the commandments. If we try to think of the sum as something that comprises all of the individual commandments, we come to a difficulty. In other words, if we take the first commandment through the 10 commandments and say, let's just make a sum of it, a summary of it, we might not come to the same way that Jesus did. The concept of the law is inexhaustible and it's endless. It can mean whatever we want it to mean. I mean, if we really want to, we can take the laws like the Pharisees did, make them mean whatever we want to. There's countless books that try to explain exactly what the law means. We have the Mishnah and the Gemara. These are works of Jews. The Mishnah is a commentary on the scriptures, and the Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. So we have like these levels of commentary that become voluminous. I mean, you could probably spend your whole life studying that and never actually get into the scriptures. That's how much is written about them. And of course, we have commentaries on this side of the line as well that sometimes are more voluminous than the scriptures themselves. So we have to be careful.
I had a theological question that I'm encountering when I talk to people. Is a lot of people will ask me, and we may have covered this already, but a lot of people will ask me, why did Christ have to come so late in the history? Why was there need for the law to begin with? And something that I've learned from my study of the scriptures so far is that this is sort of to arouse the sin consciousness, to recognize the need for a saving Messiah to begin with. But what's your take on that? The why we don't just get Jesus straight away? Why the law exists at all?
Well, yeah, we have to understand everything happens in God's time, and it has to be exactly at the historical moment that God finds appropriate. And that was the first century. At that moment, everything was ready. The world was Hellenized. There were roads. There was communications. There was a way to bring the gospel to the world. Some of the more logistic ideas. Yeah, it was a great opportunity at that moment. The Jews were ripe for it. The books that they were writing, the book of Enoch, was showing us that the Jews were ripe for this Messiah, this idea of the Son of Man coming soon. But to go back a little bit further into your question of why did they have law, we have to remember that God was creating not simply patriarchs and not families, but now he went into a higher level and he put the families together and created a nation and a kingdom. And a kingdom has to have laws, and they have to have a king. So the laws were a necessary element of a kingdom to keep a political structure. The law was also necessary to create the sense of man's disobedience. But also, on the other side, it was a picture of God's righteousness. In other words, God was the author of the law, and so the righteousness had to come from God. And so we have to see all these multifacets of the law. It's not just one thing. It's a whole lot of things all coming together to create a law, to give it value. So, again, this is one of the elements I think that a lot of people miss. They see the law as something negative, what I can't do, and then Jesus is something positive, what I ought to do. I ought to love, but that has nothing to do with the law. But that's what Kierkegaard is saying. No, that's not true. They're both the same thing, but we have to learn how do we put them together. So he says it's like how understanding is to faith. Now he's going to relate understanding to faith. It's the calculating side of faith, understanding. But understanding never really becomes certain and absolute. The law is the same way. It defines, but it never comes to a fulfillment on its own, which is love. One term defines another and likewise needs further definition. So the more we try to define our faith, the more when people say, well, give me a definition of what it means to be a Christian. Well, we think, oh, okay, that should be pretty easy. So we start out with, okay, believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Okay, then they say, okay, but what does that mean? What does it mean to believe? Oh, okay, all I have to do now is define the word believe. That's not a very easy thing to do. So we have this idea of cascading definitions. We never get to the end. We can never get to a full, complete definition of what our faith is all about because we're not built on definitions. This is the weakness that Paul talked about, and Kierkegaard, the weakness of the law. This is the weakness of doctrine. You can have two completely different denominations who believe in the same doctrine, but yet completely almost in opposition to one another. That's the weakness of the words, the weakness of doctrine. It's still, man plays a role in transforming it into ideas. And that's why we wind up with denominations. It's important to understand that many think that this is what he says here, that many think there's a conflict between the law and love. But Kierkegaard doesn't agree. He doesn't believe there's a conflict any more than the sum is a conflict of that which it is a sum of. He says that while under the law we groan because it makes demands upon us. We see not only the demands, but we see a severity to those demands. They're burdensome, and they try, for those people who try to keep the law. Plus, the law had consequences. If you broke the law, you paid a penalty. Remember lex talionis? The eye for the eye and the tooth for the tooth. You paid a penalty, even though those penalties were also a reflection of love and how we should treat our neighbor and love our neighbor. But nevertheless, we see them as consequences. The law brings death to us in that we are shown our disobedience to God and His law. And in a certain sense, there's no quarrel between the law and love in respect to knowledge. The law requires and love gives, he tells us. So I thought, what is he talking about here? Well, to the best I can interpret that, the law requires obedience, but love forgives. So the law requires something from us, but love gives something. It gives forgiveness. And it gives grace and mercy as well. Love does not want to do away with any commandment, but with love, things are more definite than in the law. So what he's telling us is that the law isn't trying to destroy the law. I mean, the love isn't trying to destroy the law. And Jesus even made this statement. He says, I haven't come to destroy the law or the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. So we have Jesus' witness that love isn't here to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, to fill it in, to give it the meaning that God always intended it to have. There is no
something I just want to add here, just to fill in the conversation here. As I read through the Bible, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, is how often Jesus is tempted by those who want him to create some sort of infraction of the law by healing people on the Sabbath, right?
Right.
And how this presents this tension. And I just it's hard for me to get my mind around the concept that people want to catch him in the act of restoring someone to life or restoring their sight or casting a demon out of them, and having that somehow in conflict with the what seems to be a perverse understanding of law.
That's what he even calls it. Kierkegaard does. He calls it a kind of perverse understanding of the law. because they weren't interested in really the law. They were interested in their own doctrine. They were interested in preserving the Pharisaical concept of God rather than in opening their eyes and listening for truth. They had their truth. They were done. They had it. Books closed. We don't need a Jesus. We don't need a Jesus coming here, trying to change things.
Well, this is the other really amazing thing in the readings that I've done. It's just how frequently Jesus astonishes the learned priests.
Yeah.
Right? Is that like he'll say something off the cuff and it just shatters their mind. They're just like, where did this man learn this? Who taught him this? Like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the particular episode when everybody knows when he says, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and what is unto God. And it's just like mind explosion. Like, how did a man think of that? Or the Sermon on the Mount,
well, when he was challenged of healing, he said, "If my Father works, so do I."
Yeah,
I and my Father are one.
Yeah, or can Satan drive out Satan? Right? And and it just over and over again, you hear these descriptions of those trying to entrap him in some sort of infraction of the law. Just be there. You can just. It paints a very colorful picture of how their just jaws are dropped wide open at the things he's saying.
And how angry they must have gotten too when people are put in that position, undermining their whole entire structure. Very difficult to deal with.
They're totally astonished. It's really wonderful to read.
It is. It kind of puts a smile on your face sometimes.
Oh.
There's no quarrel between love and the law, he says, for love is the fulfilling of the law. The demands of the law are not any different than the demands of love, and its fulfillment is absolutely one with the demands. So God is present in the law just as he's present in Christ. This is my explanation here. That we have to see God in the law just as we see God in Christ. Both bring about a sense of guilt. Both with the guilt Christ brings also the promise of grace. So we have, with the law, we have a sense of guilt. With Christ, we also have a sense of guilt. If you've also ever read the Sermon on the Mount, you should be filled with the sense of guilt. But with Christ, we also have a promise fulfillment of grace and forgiveness. So that's really the difference between the law and between Christ and love, is that the law represents only that sketch, only that one piece of God's salvation. First, you got to be guilty. First, you got to know what you did wrong before I can tell you what you're going to do right. So this is what he's doing. But what law are we speaking about? Back to him again. We're speaking about God's law. There's a law that love will fulfill to make it love. This is divine or Christian love. Now, this is kind of an interesting little statement. There is a law that love will fulfill to make it love. So, love, the law has to play in order to make the law love, it has to fulfill a particular role. And it does fill that role to make it part of love. To make it so that we can summarize it or summate it as love. There's a law, in other words, in order for love to be fulfilled, it must bring about forgiveness and grace. But many are confused as to what it constitutes to be law. So what does it mean to be law? He questions that. In worldly wisdom, love is thought to be a relationship between man and man, meaning neighbor love. But in Christianity, love is the relationship between man and God, where God is the middle term. So we have man, God, and man. Man doesn't love man directly in Christianity. He loves man through God. And we're going to see this. He's going to develop this idea. If the relationship with God is left out, this is not love, but a mutual illusion of love. Now on page 113, I have another little quotation here. For to love God is to love oneself in truth. To help another human being to love God is to love another man. To be helped by another human being to love God is to be loved. So what Kierkegaard is saying is that true love is to help another person towards God. And the way you know you're loved is because somebody is helping you towards God. Like you and I, we help each other in that way. I
Isn't
help
that that's the most beautiful expression of love there can possibly be when you really think about it. Because if to truly love someone is to help them love God, what are you essentially doing? You're saying, I love you so much that, you know, I want you to have a blessed eternity. It's right. It's
well, and that's why people, if they believe in hell and you're going to suffer for eternity, then don't you think you should tell other people what they can do to avoid it? You know, and they don't.
well. So I think I read this in Kierkegaard, and I've been thinking about it in my own life because, and I was telling this off camera to Bob earlier. That because I'm sort of an unusual Christian, my interest, my extensive training in philosophy, my interest in advanced technology and the Bible and stuff like that, it puts me in conversation with people who normally wouldn't be taking the Bible very seriously. But I find that sometimes I worry when I talk to them about Jesus or the Bible that it seems like I have to talk to each person differently. Because one approach doesn't seem to work with one individual where it works with another individual. And I believe somewhere, I don't know if it's in this, I believe it's later on in Works of Love, where Kierkegaard speaks about the wisdom of the horse trainer. I don't know if you got to that part yet, Bob, but he talks about how different sorts of colts and horses have, the really wise horse trainer understands they have different personalities and that they have to discipline and incentivize and train up the horses differently according to their personality. I just wonder if you could speak to that for a second about how we love our friends in order that they find God and how we discern what to tell them and how to tell them. Because there are some people I talk to and I'll talk to them about, I don't know, maybe I'll talk to them about, hey, maybe this hell thing is actually a real thing and it instills a sense of urgency in them. But other individuals, if you talk about hell, they just check out, you know.
You don't I don't open up with that.
Well, can you speak to the wisdom of how to talk to different individuals about loving God?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question that really we need to do a podcast on, or I need to do a video on, or something has to happen to help people. Because I think it's awkward. People find it awkward. It's hard to begin. It's kind of like jumping on the Ferris wheel. You know, you're afraid to because you know you're going to miss it and you're going to get knocked off. And it is very difficult, and I do respect that. When I was younger, I was extremely naive. Oh, extremely naive. I had no divination of spirit whatsoever. People could lie to me, and I'd believe it. I mean, I was pathetic. But through my faith, through my walk with God, He's made me very perceptive about people. He's brought me to different studies in psychology and so forth, where I've become very perceptive about people. And He does this. He develops us with talents. Sometimes He takes us through that kind of a development, more of a professional kind of a development, so that we learn about psychology. And other times, we just hang around with people and we learn through just living. And some people are better at it than others. But I think the most powerful testimony is personal witness. What do I believe? And why do I believe it? And then let the other person ask questions. You know, we can't deny our faith. If we do, Jesus says, if you deny me, I'll deny you. So we have to tell people, first of all, what do I believe and why do I believe it? And what has it done for my life? That's called being a witness. And that's all we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to scare people into it with hell. We're not supposed to persuade them with eloquent speeches about philosophy and theology and show people how smart we are. We're simply to tell people, who am I? And I'm an open book. Look inside me. I am what I appear to be. There's no curtain. And if you like what you see, you can have it too. If you want to believe, today's the day. Just start. Just give it to God and let it happen. We don't have to be persuasive. This is why I disagree with so many other people. I don't have to get down into the dirt with other people. I give them the gospel, and then they have a choice. They can believe it or not. I don't need to fool them into believing. And I don't need to persuade them into believing. That's God's business. God does that. And he does that through their life experiences. They're brought down to the very pit of life. That's when God says, do you remember what Luke and Bob told you? Okay, now think about that.
Yeah. I just, I care so much about my friends. I don't want them to have to go through what we've gone through in order to come to these conclusions. I'd like for, I'd like for them to not have any sort of existential crisis that makes them think of something that we planted a long time ago. I'd like to save them the trouble of that, because I can tell you, Bob and I have both been through it, and it is not fun.
Yeah. Well, it's a good ideal to have that. Maybe we can save people from that, but we can't. They really have to. They really have to make a realization of who they are, and that's part of the truth, is to see themselves as they really are. And most people distract themselves. That's why I love Kierkegaard so much, because he tries to cut through all of that, to say all these things are distractions, like in the present age. This brings us to say everything out there is trying to distract you from stopping and thinking about who you are. What's the truth? How are you and who are you as you stand before God naked? And that's why I love him so much.
Yeah. I'll tell you what. With a lot of the research I'm doing on cutting a lot of the technology that's being gradually rolled out right now, is that Kierkegaard's becoming even, more relevant. So we'll see. All right, I'll let you go back to it, man.
Okay. So it depends upon those who judge to know how to judge correctly. If a judge doesn't know love, then he cannot love properly, because he does not understand the purpose of the law. So what is it to be loved by another human being? And he reiterates, true love is to help someone to love God. If this is missing, one is deceived into loving another human in human terms, which is not true love. It may feel like true love, especially when we get romantic. We may feel that we love one another to the maximum. We can't love each other any more erotically than we're loving each other. But we're here to say that's not so. There is a whole other level of love that you can have with a woman or with a man that goes beyond erotic, and that's to love them by teaching them to love God. The question is it really love when one shows only devotion to another? Is devotion the same thing as love? From the divine point of view, to demand such devotion is to misunderstand, for we cannot belong to another unless we belong to God first. This is very important here. We cannot possess or be possessed by another without first being possessed by God. So we must love the other person, and that we must want them to love God and help to accomplish this. The true love has this as its goal. So we can't. A lot of times people feel their wife or their husband is a possession of theirs, or I'm possessed by them. And that's wrong. We're only possessed by God. And that's the strength and the power of true love, is to be able to have that first and then have the second. the poet, or simply most people, including professing Christians even, professing believers, I wrote, but professing Christians, cannot have an understanding to love one's enemy, no less the Christian demand to hate the beloved out of love. One who loves his enemy is a potential martyr, for he must turn the other cheek. Okay, this is the conflict that most people have. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount explicitly states it without any doubt, without any quiver. Love your enemy. You've heard that it was said to love your neighbor, love your friend, and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, you must love your enemy. So, and do good to those who hurt you. This is our obligation. And that requires turning the other cheek. And what does that require? We'll see. He fills in this a little bit better than me. But what that requires is acknowledging you may be a martyr. You need to think like a martyr. And you must be willing to put everything out there on the line to be a believer. There is no other choice as far as Jesus is concerned. It's not love your neighbor and, only hate your enemy a little bit. That's not what it says. Or only hate your enemy when your enemy is friendly to you. Or only hate your enemy when he's going to threaten you. It's love your enemy, period. There's nothing beyond that. And so I have to take him literally there. And I have to be ready to be a martyr. And that's not easy to do. Because I think by nature, I'm probably a coward. But that requires something above and beyond our human nature. That's why it's divine love.
Can I ask a practical question? I want to know if you thought through this issue.
Sure.
Is my microphone okay, by the way?
Yeah, the microphone is okay. We get a little of that tapping noise, but that may not even come through in the podcast. It's not much. It's not distracting.
Okay. We are not isolated as individuals, right?
Right.
It is perhaps, in a way, easier for me to say that I'm prepared to be a martyr if I follow Christ. But there are some places in the world where, by even identifying with Christ, one implicates the rest of your family as well. What would you say to those individuals who maybe feel like it's not just about their own soul, but it may implicate others as well?
We're ready to lay our lives down for our friends. We're ready to lay our lives down for others.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, what if the persecution could extend beyond our own life?
Well, it did in the first century.
Right.
And we have examples. We have women who were pregnant, who gave birth while they were in prison, and then who were executed. There's a famous case, and I can't remember her name, in France, where she gave her baby up to somebody to take care of it.
Right.
So yes, there's the danger of that. We all we can do is cling to God, because the alternative is turning what Jesus says upside down again and saying it's okay if, and then we can say that about everything Jesus says.
Yeah, we have an escape clause.
It's okay if we have an escape clause. We have an exception. So we're going to take that one. Then we become more Pharisaical.
Right.
But I think, in answering your question completely candidly, I don't think everybody's ready to be a martyr. And that God will bring us to. I think that's a maturity in Christ. I think that we can't demand people or expect them to be like that. We have to, however, set the example. Our mature have to be willing to do that, to show people the right way.
Yeah, I think the only concern is whether or not it would spill over to friends and family and loved ones, right? Because it's one thing to make the choice for yourself, but if we start to implicate, does being a martyr mean that we might implicate those in these concentric circles of care?
Yeah, but even if we weren't a martyr, we still implicate them. If we become fighters, don't we still implicate our family? Like if we were in ISIS and we fought against ISIS, wouldn't ISIS threaten our family? Wouldn't they do the same thing by slaughtering our family to show us we shouldn't resist them? Don't they do that even today? Yeah. So our families are always in jeopardy, regardless of what choice we make.
That's true. That's true. I was just merely putting that out there. But
no, great questions. You make me think. You make me think too much, Luke.
That's no problem I have on people. All right, keep going.
Okay, the question, if it is demanded of him, must be capable of hating his mother, his father, etc. Others will see this as hatred in that they will not understand this as even possible. So those in the world, when they hear what Jesus says about you must be capable of hating your mother and your father, your brother and your sister if you want to be in my kingdom, they see that and they say, that's not love. How can you have love and hatred mixed together like that? How can you hate your mother and your brother and your sister and your father and yet claim you have Christian love? So Kierkegaard addresses that. We have to remember that true love is helping another to love God. The time before Christianity, the world did not see the possibility between these two views of divine love and human love. So this idea of divine love and human love is something a little different. Let me find where I am in my notes here. I accidentally hit my finger on my keyboard here. Okay. So the world cannot understand divine love because it is commingled with hatred. Hatred of mother or father or friend if they get in the way of our love for God. So what he's saying is that it's not like we're just going to hate our mother and father, like some people try to say, that we have to hate our mother and father and our brother and sister, but only if they get in our way of loving God. But we'll see an example that Jesus gives us of that very thing here in a minute. Christ is the divinely understood love. He loved the whole race, and his life was a collision with the human concept of love. It was the ungodly world that crucified him. Even his disciples did not understand him. Jesus told one of his beloved, his most beloved disciple here, to get behind him, calling him Satan. He did this because his only concern was doing the will of his master, his Father. Peter had the wrong kind of love for Christ. He had human love for him. And this was the love of a friend and not divine love, or he would have seen that Christ was doing the will of God. So Peter, who is the unnamed disciple here, loved Jesus, but he loved him in a worldly way. He didn't want Jesus to become a martyr. He didn't want Jesus to die. And that's how he saw his friend as walking to death. And he said, no, I can't let you do that, Jesus. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, because you're not on God's side. You don't see the will of my Father as I do. So with Christianity comes the true explanation of what love really is. If we love as Christ loved, we too will be misunderstood as he was misunderstood. This is where we enter into that collision, Paul. Luke. People assume that it was ungodliness that collided with Christ, but this is a misunderstanding. Even the affectionate man collides with Christ in that they do not understand divine love. Christ would not sacrifice his ideas, but he sacrificed himself. He sacrificed his life. But also, and this answers your question, he set the lives of his followers on a collision course with the world. Those very people he claimed to love. By turning them into followers, he knew he was sending them to a course of martyrdom. Was it love when Christ won the devotion of his followers only to plunge them into martyrdom? What did Jesus really want? He died without confessing that he deceived them, without claiming that it was for love. So Jesus never told them directly why he loved them. He never told these things to them. He never said, I'm deceiving you or I'm loving you. So it's left to us to kind of figure that out. He did everything out of love to make man eternally happy. How? Through his relationship with God, for he was love. He brought reconciliation between God and man, which is what love does. His life was the act of forgiveness, grace, and mercy. He genuinely did love his disciples, and he did love the human race, everyone who would let themselves be saved. The fundamental untruth about the human concept of love is that it is somehow removed from the relationship with God, and therefore also from that of the law. So here I think he's speaking about the sense of emotion that accompanies love. If one loves a beloved, there's no reason to relate to our love for God. So people try to make it different. Like, well, we have a love for God, and then we have a love for man, and they're just not the same thing. They're not related in any way. Love for one's neighbor should not be removed, however, from the relationship with God or one's relationship with the law. So as we love our neighbor, we should not remove our relationship with God in order to love our neighbor. So when people say we have to love our neighbor first, you can't. Because you first have to establish a relationship with God. Then you can truly love your neighbor. So it seems that what he's saying is that there's a strange misunderstanding that love for a neighbor should not be removed from our relationship with God, and neither should our erotic love or our friendship, in the sense that Christianity should not penetrate all relationships. So what does this mean, that Christianity should not penetrate all relationships? It means that the relationship between man and God should be found in all kinds of love. And that means even in the erotic love, the romantic love. God is still present in my life, in my love for my wife, and in her love for me. I can be with a woman, and it's not a violation of anything to have a great romantic love, to have an erotic relationship with your wife or with your husband. There's nothing wrong with that, because God is in that relationship for the very reason he created Adam and Eve, to bring children. But even it goes beyond that. It's not like after we have children we no longer have any sexual desire, because we still do. And it's not wrong. It's part of who God created, how he created us. He says that love is Kierkegaard says that love is a passion of emotions. And even before a person relates himself to the object of love, he ought to first relate himself to God. And the object of love here could be a neighbor, it could be a relative, or it could be a spouse. And he must learn the demand that love is the fulfillment of the law. So somehow the law gets involved here. Love is the relationship to another human being. I think that's kind of self-explanatory there. I think we all understand that. But no matter how loving or tender a love might be, if it does not include a relationship with God, it is untruth. It is not true love. True love exists with poets without God, but it doesn't exist in our faith without God. For them, their judgments become like Romeo and Juliet, for instance. For them, their judgments become the highest judgments that they have, and it's a judgment of deception. So when we have romantic love, if God is not included, their highest concept and their judgments of what's right and wrong is a deception. A man must not belong to a woman, he kind of reiterates this, A man must not belong to a woman, or he will become obstructed by her desire or his desire to please her. So if a man loves a woman more than he loves God, then he's going to be much more easily obstructed from his love for God by his desire to please his wife, or the other way around. The woman, if she doesn't love God more than her husband, will be more easily manipulated to be obstructed by her love, from her love for God, by her love for her husband. And this is extremely important as far as marriage and romance is concerned. He's not saying that a man should not have a woman, but that we should not have such a relationship with her that we seek to please her above God, or him above God. It's not the wife who shall teach, and this is what he says here, is that it's not the wife who shall teach the husband how to love God, nor the husband to teach the wife. It's up to God to teach both. So we may be a part of that process, but it's not like the husband or the wife stands in place of God. Someone who has worldly love has a different concept of what love is. It's so different that they see Christian love as an unkindness, he says. They don't understand what Christian love is, because they're judging it against a worldly love, a deceived love, something that isn't finished. It's not complete. It's not perfect. It can't be perfect unless God is in it. And by perfect, I mean complete. When love is interpreted through our God relationship, we are prevented from entering into an illusion or a self-deception of love. So it's our relationship with God that prevents us from becoming self-deceived, which is impossible for man to do alone. Self-denial and sacrifice are then seen differently. And this kind of goes back to your question. In the worldly arena, how can you do that and jeopardize your family? How can you be a believer? Just say, no, I reject Christ. You'll save your whole family. Isn't that more important? No, it's not more important. You can't compromise your faith, even at the sake of your family or your own life. Were you going to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I thought of a unique scenario recently. And I imagine you've maybe dealt with it at some point, and there might be someone who would be interested in hearing your perspective in light of all these conversations that we've had. Because something that I am completely in alignment with the Bible and Kierkegaard and everybody else is like if you want to have like a nice, comfortable life in this world, do not be a Christian. Do not. Because if you really, really take it seriously, you will be at odds with the financial structure. You will be at odds with the political structure. You will be at odds with the pop culture structure. You'll be at odds with the scientific structure. You'll be at odds with the romantic structure. Everything that Christianity teaches is, if you take it very seriously, this is my experience, is in diametric opposition to whatever the world preaches.
Well, okay. It's obvious, Luke, that God has opened your eyes, because that's what happens. You don't see the evil when you're part of the evil. You see it when you can step out from it. Then you see it all over the place.
Oh my God! I shouldn't say it, but it's like it's. I mean, it's the Twilight Zone. I mean, this place is this world is the Twilight Zone. Oh man, this is a really weird place we're living in right now. But that aside, I try to think, what if a husband or a wife or a son or a daughter found themselves in a different religion? Say they grew up in an Islamic background, or they grew up in a Baha'i background, or a Mormon background. Or let's say that a husband was completely living in secular categories and he married another secularist, and then an event happens. They have the Damascus experience where the veil is lifted and God speaks to them directly, and they become a Christian. You know, especially in these marital connections, you know, what do we do when we're in that scenario where, you know, someone is waking up to the gospel but may find themselves within a family structure that's thoroughly secular or a completely different religion altogether? What have you ever seen that happen, and what that looks like? I mean, typically individuals, they figure out their religious categories and then they gravitate towards like-minded individuals, and that is the case. I think Bob needs to take a break for 1 second.
Okay.
So, depending on how long Bob is away for, I'm just going to keep talking here. The general point that I need to raise is how to deal when you have a existential personality shift after you have had this conversion experience, and how to continue relating to individuals.
Okay. So yeah, I can answer that question. Actually, Paul had to address that question because that's what happened in the first century. What happened was Gentiles were marrying Gentiles, and then a Gentile would be converted. The husband or the wife would be converted, but the other spouse wasn't converted. So you had mixed marriages, mixed of faith, and just like any other situation, Paul gave ideas on how to deal with that. To be as tolerant as you possibly could with the other. To try to live with the other person as much as possible. Even because today we have the same thing. One spouse might be converted, the other one might not be, or they might be strong, have a strong hold in another religion, and they may not be all that compatible, those two religions. But nevertheless, Paul addresses the Christian husbands and wives to try to live at peace as much as possible with them. He says that if it gets so bad that you can't do it, and that the husband or the wife wants to separate from you, then let them go. And you won't be held to that. And it sounds like what he's saying is that if that's the case, it's like an annulment. He said in that case, allow it as an annulment, meaning it never really took place because two Christians never really bonded together. So you're not held to the same standard. So you can remarry. That appears to be what most theologians that I know of render the scriptures to mean in that particular case. That's how I interpret it myself. So yeah, the idea is to live as peaceably as possible under those circumstances. But if it really doesn't work out, you know, you're free to leave. You're free to leave.
Well, yeah, we shouldn't give people excuses for leaving their marriage. You know.
No, no.
But you've got to do everything that you can if it's still not working out and they walk out on you. But I think it's a satisfactory answer. So why don't you go ahead with what you have left of the lesson?
Okay. The divine love under the relationship with God leads the love to God, which we said before. Without the relationship, it does not lead to God, but is restricted to the human relationship and its goals. And this is the conflict and the collision that he talks about here. When we have a misunderstanding of love, one leading to God, one not leading to God. When we conform to the idea of love in the human relationship, we become love because we conform to our lover's desires and needs. So we may become a loving individual, we may become love in the sense that Kierkegaard means it here, but it's different because the love that we're becoming is defined by the goals, the desires, and the needs of our mate or of the object of our love. If we run counter to their desires and needs, as a Christian might, okay, as you were saying, in this particular case, I'll read that again. But if we run counter to their desires and needs, as a Christian might, he might find himself no longer loved by the beloved. So in the case where, let's say I wanted my wife to do certain things and she said, no, I can't do those things. They're unchristian things to do. That might stop me from loving her if I were an unbeliever. I would say, well, I don't care what your God tells you to do. I'm telling you to do this. I'm telling you to wear a veil or whatever it might be. And that creates that collision, that conflict. In Christianity, he says we try to remove the collision without removing love. In this relationship, to love oneself, it is to love God, and that means to help the other person to love God. In the world, we don't talk about the God relationship as being a part of love, which is true. Even many Christians don't really consider their love or their marriage really a bond between them and God. And therefore, we wind up with a lot of divorces there as well, because we're lacking that bond between man, God, and man or woman. It is thought to be part of the imagination by many. In other words, this relationship, this special relationship between man and God and woman, is considered to be more of an imagination. This really doesn't exist. It's a nice idea, nice thought, but life is life, and people don't get along, and that's just the way it is. They seek to free themselves from this relationship so they can free themselves. And I think what he means there is, the idea is that if we can take God out of the picture, we can make ourselves very happy. I don't know if I spoke. Yeah, I speak to that. Since I went through the 60s, I'll speak to exactly what group of people try to do that. But let me get there. On page 119, see if I had a quote on that. I'm not sure I actually had a quote on that, but that's where I'm at. He talks about he belongs to God. People find this kind of bondservant very burdensome. In other words, to belong to God. If I say I belong to God, I'm a Christian, and he is the one, he's my king. I'm like his property. That's how I see myself. And they wish to eliminate God to obtain their freedom in love. So people in the world don't want that kind of bondservant. They don't want to be a bond to God, a bondservant to God. They don't want to serve God. They want to be kings more than bondservants. And in order to do that, they have to eliminate God. And when they do that, then they're left with freedom to love in any way I want to. Now, for the hippie, love was associated to freedom. You've probably seen movies and stuff, but that's what it was. Love and freedom were the same thing. Okay? To do whatever they wanted to do. I'd say, what was the song? Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. It's a kind of freedom. Hey, I do whatever I want. I've got nothing to lose.
I believe it made it into a Janis Joplin song.
Yeah. For the Christian, love is placing ourselves as a bondservant through our devotion to God's will. So two totally different ways to looking at it. One wants a love that can do anything it wants, a freedom to love. But the other wants to love as a servant to God, loving within the boundaries of a servant of God. So what is law, again, and its demand on men, he kind of asks. Many will say that it's up to man to decide. But how do we decide what's legal and what's not legal? In our country, we have a very complex method of creating laws and changing laws. Opinion of the individual is possible, or group discussion and agreement. Voting is another way to determine laws. Compromise. How do we create perfect laws, though, and define them so everyone understands them? I mean, that's what lawyers are for, isn't it? Don't they help uncomplicate things and make the law simple? Maybe not. Must be another podcast. Many will say that it's. Let's see. Okay.
Oh no, I was just responding.
Oh no, it's almost impossible to create laws that please everyone, and it then becomes a democratic process. In other words, to satisfy most of the people most of the time. Is there another way to resolve the legal issue? Well, we could look for leadership to discover the meaning of the law, or at least for someone to set those boundaries. So we could look for a king, and that king would establish the law for the realm. And if you had a problem or a question, take it before the king, and he'll make the decision. So there's all sorts of ways he's bringing up here as to how do you create laws? How do you create perfect laws? Not easy for man to do.
It was pretty easy for Solomon. He was so woke.
Yeah, well, that's what we need, another Solomon to do that. Moses did that too, a little bit. Most men, however, live out their lives without ever knowing what laws demand is. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. So most people live their whole life and never really ask the question, and nor do they ever get an answer as to what does it mean to have perfect love, what is perfect law, and what does it really ask of me to do. So most people never come to that answer. And so we'll have to wait till next week to find out where Kierkegaard takes us from here. Any questions, Luke?
No, I think you answered a ton. I don't think people understand how many, there's kind of a pre-show to our lessons, and I had quite a number of questions for Bob today, so I imagine he might be a little intellectually maxed out. I put him through there was a show before the show, and I asked him some pretty difficult things before we even went on air, so have to thank Bob for doing an exceptional job leading the discussion.
I look at that as a warm-up for me, Luke.
Oh, just tune it up with old Luke's softball pitches. I see how it is. I'll try to think of some real brain busters before the next episode. You've seen it all. You've seen it all, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob. And
you're welcome.
And seriously, I think I speak on behalf of everyone who just listened to you teach. I mean, your wisdom is invaluable and rivals Solomon in some respects.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
All right.
I know you don't pay me, but you don't need to compliment me like that.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Everybody. And you can download the Noetic app and listen on the podcasting app that Apple and other services provide, and follow along on SoundCloud and subscribe on YouTube. And we'll be back next week. Okay. Bye.
Hey, bye.